What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Nick with Leverage Media, and welcome to another episode of Path to a Million podcast. Loan forgiveness time for PPP, going through all the details of that. If you missed the kind of overview, I did one maybe about 35 minutes long where I really go through everything you need to know. Now we're starting to dive into some of the more detail-oriented stuff. So on this one, we're going to talk about what documentation are you going to need. There's two kinds of documentation. There's going to be the documentation that you actually have to turn in. There's going to be the documentation that you have to maintain, and you have to maintain that for 6 years, and that's in case you get audited. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of how the loan forgiveness process is going to work, is you are going to fill out this application either on paper or online. I would imagine most of the bigger banks are going to create some kind of online portal, and you're going to submit that to your bank. The bank is going to be in charge of the loan forgiveness. This means that, just like my bank in particular, like my local community bank, they probably did hundreds of, probably didn't do 1,000, but they probably did several hundred loans. They are not going to now go through and do like a deep dive into whether somebody did the math correctly on the worksheet or not. They're pretty much just going to assume that it is correct. But you're going to have to turn in some of this. You're going to have to prove the numbers that you put onto the worksheet, and then you're going to have to save things in case you ever get audited that would really like show, so that, because it would be easy to it'd be easy to make some numbers up on worksheets and be able to kind of show it proof-wise to the bank and get the forgiveness. But if they ever came and audited you from the SBA, you have to make sure that your documentation is in order. So for the documentation needed, you're going to need the PPP Schedule A. So that's going to be one of these worksheets that is in, or it's not really a worksheet, I guess. It's the, there is a worksheet. Let's see. So Schedule A, oh, it is the worksheet. Okay. Let me get down to, okay, so you need the PPP loan forgiveness calculation form. Sorry, I skipped ahead. Schedule A is basically, so calculation form is going to be kind of like showing your work. Schedule A is going to look like this, where it's kind of just like all of the, so it's like all of the answers, all right? Then with the, let's see. So, all right, so for payroll, so there's going to be 3 sections that you're going to need to keep more, you're going to have to submit more documentation for. One is going to be the payroll. So you're going to need to prove that you paid it. So you're going to have to prove that you paid like your gross payroll. This could be your payroll report, or if you have like, if you don't use a payroll system, then you could just use like bank statements. Like if you're a sole proprietor, an independent contractor, you would just show like your bank statement. That this is how you paid yourself and you use the money for that. But most of us that have employees use payroll services. You would just print out that report and show that. The other thing you're going to need to show is tax forms. So you're going to need to show a federal 941. So this is your quarterly wage report. And then you're going to need to do that for the state as well. That's going to be your quarterly business and individual employee wage reporting and the unemployment insurance tax filings reported. So remember, you'll be able to use the gross wages that you pay, and then also any state and like unemployment insurance is probably going to be the one thing that you're going to be able to do on top of that. You won't be able to do that for like the employer part of the FICA tax. You won't be able to do anything. You won't be able to do the federal unemployment. You won't be able to get refunded for that, but for the state side, you will be able to. Then you're also going to, so basically the proof that you paid the money and the tax forms that show that you reported it. The third thing is going to be the payment receipts, canceled checks, or account statements documenting the amount of any employer contribution to employee health insurance and retirement plans that the borrower included in the forgiveness amount. So for all of this stuff, if you do not include it in the forgiveness amount, like say for whatever reason you didn't include, Mary Jones' salary in the forgiveness amount, you don't want to include that money into the you don't want to include, or I'm sorry, you don't have to have documentation for that. So if you didn't ask for forgiveness on it, you don't need to document it. But for this one, it's basically any of those benefits that you pay to your employees. It's going to be the employer side of the contribution. So if you pay half of your employees' healthcare, you're going to only be able to claim forgiveness for the half that you pay, not for the half that the employee pays. The second section is going to be the full-time equivalent employees. So this is going to be documentation showing a couple of different things. So with this first part, you get to choose what you want your baseline to be for your full-time employee count. So you can either choose February 15th, 2019 through June 30th, 2019, or you can choose January 1st, 2020 through February 29th, 2020. So you can choose whichever one of those that you that is better for you. So with that choice, you want to pick the one that is lower. So the lower the bar is, the easier it is for you to qualify for it. So I would imagine that most of us used the January 1st to February 29th, 2020, just because that's like what was actually happening when all of this started. So you're going to have documentation showing what that average, so it says the average number of full-time equivalent employees on payroll per month employed by the bar between January 1st, 2020 and February 29th, 2020. So if you had 7 employees in January and you had 5 employees in February, your average monthly is going to be 6. So that's going to be the number that you need to have by June 30th to qualify for not having lost any headcount. And we'll get into how to calculate the full-time equivalent employee stuff later. But basically, it's a 10-hour-a-week person is kind of like a quarter of a full-time employee. 30 hours a week is 3/4 worth. All right. The selected time period must be the same time period selected for purposes of completing PPP Schedule A, line 11. Documents may include payroll tax filings reported, or that will be reported to the IRS, and state quarterly. So this is basically the documentation to show not only what your headcount was in that time period that you're using for your baseline, but after, like during the 8 weeks and afterwards. So it'll basically be the same paperwork that you're using for the payroll documentation. All right, non-payroll documentation verifying existence of the obligation services prior to February 15, 2020 and eligible payments from the covered period. So business mortgage interest payments, if you own your building and you're going to ask for forgiveness of the interest payments, you are going to need a copy of the lender's amortization schedule and proof that you paid the interest, either that it accrued during that time or you paid it during those 8 weeks. The other thing is, and this is what's important for this non-payroll side of things, because everything has to have been in place by February 15th, 2020, you need to show, you basically need to show them that you had this in place on Feb. So you have to show them your February 2020 like lender account statements, or if the amortization schedule shows that you had this before February 2020, then that should be good enough. If you pay rent or a lease, a copy of the current lease agreement and receipts or canceled checks verifying eligible payments from the covered period, or you can use account statements from February 2020 and from the covered period through 1 month after the end of the covered period, verifying eligible payments. Then let's see, business utility payments, again, copies of invoices from February 2020, and those paid during the covered period, and receipts, canceled checks, or account statements verifying those eligible payments. So that's all the stuff that you're going to need to turn into your bank with the application. Then there's documents that everybody's going to need to maintain, but it's not required to submit. So this is going to be basically all of the documentation that supports the math that you're doing on the worksheet, that's calculating the full-time equivalent employees, that's calculating the salary and the hourly wages, and if you decrease those by more than 75%. So these need to be held onto for 6 years, and they can basically, that's what they're going to use if they audit you. So the PPP Schedule A worksheet or its equivalent and the following. So this is the worksheet where you show your documentation. Documentation supporting the listing of each individual employee and PPP Schedule A worksheet table 1, including the salary, hourly wage reduction calculation if necessary. So you're going to need to individually show all of your employees, and then you're going to need to do calculations showing if there was any, like what the reduction was if you did reduce them below the 75%. Documentation supporting the listing of each individual employee in PPP Schedule A worksheet table 2, specifically that each listed employee received during any single pay period in 2019 compensation at an annualized rate of more than $100,000. So the reason why this is important is because if you have somebody who was making over $100,000 prior to this, let's say they were making $200,000, the most that you can pay them through this program is $100,000. So let's say you completely shut down and you would have laid them off otherwise, and you said to them, hey, we're going to keep you on. I'm going to pay you $100,000, like the maximum amount, which is the 8 weeks of $100,000, like annualized amount. You would technically be cutting them from 200 to 100. So that would be cutting them 50%, but because of that, they don't qualify for the cutting 25%. So the reason why you need to show that proof is that you're not just dropping people into that category so that you can cut them more. So that's going to be why you need to show the documentation to prove basically that person was making $100,000. The third one is documentation regarding any employee job offers and refusals, firings for cause, voluntary resignations, and written requests by any employee for reductions in work schedule. So this is going to be, what do they call that? Full-time equivalent reduction exceptions. So this is going to allow you, I used this example earlier, but my girlfriend had she has an attorney that works for her, or did work for her, and she put in her notice, she gave like 30 days notice, a couple of weeks after she got her disbursement. So she basically was going, it was almost like right after the disbursement. So her 30 days was just up, I think, like on Friday. She still has 4 weeks left in her 8 weeks. So I was worried that was going to impact her, but this full-time equivalent reduction exemptions exempts anyone that, and I did a video about this prior, to where if you offer somebody that, like, let's say you, maybe you laid them off, or I think it's mainly if you laid people off. If you give them their job back, you have to make a written request or a written offer. If they reject that and they say they don't want to come back to work, then it wouldn't count against you in the PPP stuff. It can impact their unemployment though, so you have to make a decision on whether you want to do that or not. Firings for cause. I've heard a couple of people that have reached out to me and said that they fired somebody just because they deserve to get fired, not because of this. So that is also an exemption. What was the other one? Voluntary resignations, like my girlfriend's employee, and written requests by any employee for reductions in work schedule. So they'll have to have written that out, similar to resigning. Normally when people quit, they write something out. So if they did get a cut in their work schedule, you've got to make sure that that's in writing, that they were requesting it and you granted it. So that won't affect you on the head count, and I believe on the salary hourly piece. All right, last one is documentation supporting the PPP Schedule A worksheet, full-time equivalent reduction safe harbor. Let me just give you kind of an overview of that. Let me find that again. Okay, so this is basically so you have to meet these two conditions for this part. The borrower reduced its full-time equivalent employee levels in the period beginning February 15th, 2020 and ending April 26th, 2020. So within that time, you reduced your employees. Number two, the second condition that has to be met. The borrower then restored its full-time equivalent employee levels by no later than June 30th to its full-time equivalent employee levels in the borrower's pay period that included February 15th, 2020. So you have to get you reduced your staff between February 15th and April 26th. You then have until June 30th, 2020 to restore the levels of the pay period that included February 15th, 2020. If you do that, then that will not, you won't get counted against you. So like for me, my 8 weeks ends on June 4th for my office. I kept everybody, but let's say I cut half the staff. If I had to cut half the staff, I've got until June 30th to bring them back at their regular hours and their regular pay. So so that's that. Let me just make sure I've got all, I think that's all the documentation. Yeah, and then you just have to keep any documentation that supports the loan application, that any of the certifications that you needed the money, documentation necessary to support the borrower's loan forgiveness application, and you got to keep all that for 6 years. So, so that's the documentation piece. Let me check to see if there's any comments. No comments. So just be sure that you have all of that stuff ready to go, just in case. Keep it in a file somewhere. Keep it digitally on your computer, so you've got a backup copy in case you can't find the physical copy. So, all right, we'll talk to you next one.